So we talked about the product, but like I said, you know, if you apply it wrong, it doesn't matter how great the product is, it can still fail to be effective. So first of all, try to do no harm. And this is something I was so guilty of when I worked at an animal shelter. It's like, there's only so many ways you can show you care to the animals, right? You can overfeed them, you can overclean them, you can, you know, or you can write cute cage cards to promote them for adoption. But once you've exhausted your cage cards, we try to just protect them by cleaning them. And what's happening for these cats? They've been pulled out of their cages, placed in a carrier that in itself is not very easy to clean, harder to clean the cages because it's scratched plastic. Very stressful for the cats. In a study that we just completed where we looked at risk factors for upper respiratory infection across 9 shelters nationally, increased frequency of movement in and out of the cage or from one cage to another in the first 7 days of care was one of only a small handful of risk factors that we found was significantly associated with a greater risk of upper respiratory infection. So this really takes a toll on cats, not only from the disease exposure, but from the stress that it induces. And this is a shelter that shall remain nameless, but it's a nice fancy new building in California. And this was a shelter that had double-sided runs, but it was kind of underbuilt. And so they had dogs on either side of the double-sided runs. The guillotine doors were closed. And they didn't have enough time to just take dogs out one by one. And so what they did is they just put all the dogs in the play yard. And what do we see here? We see really cute, highly adoptable little Queensland here, kind of short. I don't know if you can really appreciate that, but I was enamored. And there was a couple of other dogs that we actually were planning to take home with us from this shelter visit. And can you see that? That's coming out of this skinny hound. It looks like parvo. I mean, it's pure blood. It also could have been distemper. And every single dog was closely exposed to a massive dose. Would have been better to keep 2 dogs per run and just keep them in their run. Would have been better just to scoop. Would have been better to have fewer dogs. So many things that would have been better, but this system of cleaning really was putting the dogs at enormous risk. So think about, like, if you come to a point where you're like, we just can't do this right, think about whether it would be better to not do it at all. So, how many of you have double compartment housing? Awesome. How many of you have double compartment housing but can't use it correctly because you get too full? Bummer. So recognize the cost that imposes is not only the increased cost for staff time and, you know, just the complication of trying to clean, but also the cost that imposes in terms of creating disease and lowering the number of animals that make it out to the point of being released alive. And think about whether you can't move animals through more quickly or delay intake for some animals so that you can use that double-sided housing for the way it's meant to be used. It's probably one of the most powerful things you can do to protect animal health. So, limits chemical exposure. We don't get dogs being splashed by animals on either side. Here's double compartment housing for cats. How many of you have double compartment housing for cats? Excellent. I mean, that's going up from what there used to be. From the time, how many of you have it from the time of intake? Woohoo! For the rest of you, we have posted on our website how to make portals in your stainless steel cages so you can create double-sided housing for cats. That was the other most powerful predictor for respiratory infection risk in our study. But I'm really aiming to talk to you about mostly things that you can do today. I think I've talked enough about this. Built-in systems for an actual shelter facility, those are great. And if you work at a larger facility, it's great to get something that just premixes the chemicals for you. Accelerated hydrogen peroxide and the quaternary ammonium compounds and those bleach products that I mentioned are really the best products for that type of system. So it's nice that accelerated hydrogen peroxide is out now. It used to be that really quaternary ammonium was the product of choice for a central system. If you have to use mops and buckets, first of all, choose a good product for that. Are any of you who use mops and buckets using something like this? Could you? This way, you put rinse water in one side, disinfectant in the other side, and it maintains the activity of the disinfectant. So you clean an area, you rinse the mop in the rinse water, and then restock it with relatively clean disinfectant. It's more likely to work. Label your mop buckets and other cleaning products by color so that they just stay in the area that they're meant for. And especially prioritize juvenile animals and animals that have been vaccinated for less than a week. Make sure that in those areas you're taking special care to mix mop water up freshly and make sure that the cleaning implements that you use in those areas stay with those areas. The worst thing you can do is migrate a mop bucket, say from the front office into a puppy holding area where puppies might be on the floor, or migrate something from an intake area where you have a lot of traffic going back and forth into an area where you might have kittens on the floor of a get acquainted room. So think about who's contacting what surfaces and prioritize really effective practices for the populations most at risk. How many of you are using a built-in system? Not very many. Probably a lot of you aren't from giant shelters, but this was something stunning we realized, so I'll just mention it. They're great because they take all the guesswork and hazards out of mixing chemicals, so that's nice. And there's some pretty small wall-mounted type of systems, or there's giant central systems. But they have these little tubes in them. Those tubes need to be replaced every 3 to 6 months, or they start putting the wrong amount of disinfectant in, too little disinfectant in, so it's not going to be effective. And the manufacturers aren't real aggressive about making that information available, so good thing to know if you're using one of those systems. This is one of the delights of my existence, and I get to sit around and read really obscure articles about various unsanitary conditions that make me afraid to stir out of my home. When people wash their hands and then touch surfaces with wet, undried hands, they were able to transmit 68,000, 31,000, and 1,900 microbial units, respectively. If they dried their hands using 10 seconds with a cloth towel and 20 seconds with an air towel, it reduced those numbers to 140, 655, and 28. So an enormous reduction. In fact, by moistening a surface, if you don't kill all the germs on it and you don't dry it, you facilitate germ transfer. And like if you're in the airport and you're in a hurry and you go to the bathroom and you're not going to dry your hands, it would be better not to wash your hands. Gross as that seems. And, so running out of paper towels, poor choice in an animal shelter. Think about that also in terms of surfaces. If the floor is moist, that's going to facilitate tracking disease all around the facility versus if the floor is dry. So that's why, if you're going to be moistening the surface, you want to combine that moistening with a chemical that's going to inactivate germs. Questions about that? Yeah.
What about using towels instead of paper towels to dry?
So really, this is an area where single-use towels are worthwhile. So, if you wash your hands and then dry them, you know that there's some germs still on your hands and they go on the towel. And then what do? You wash your hands, you've moistened them. Now they contact the towel and you rub them all around, and those germs from the previous person who used the towel can be transmitted to your hands. So paper towels or single-use raglets that get thrown from clean to a dirty bin. If you want to be more environmental about it, you can go that route. But that's not one of the places where we want to be saving. So the process, when we talk about cleaning, we're actually cleaning, disinfecting, potentially rinsing if you're using a product that needs to be rinsed, and drying. That's actually the sanitation process. And this horrifying picture, this is another shelter where dogs were dying of pneumonia, and it turned out it was a bacteria that was getting in through their feet and tracking through their blood and getting into their lungs. And we actually cultured it out of the hose from their disinfectant dispenser. So that is, it just created a little bacterial colony, and they were living very joyfully in there. So that's why we really need that drying step. Go through and look at where is there a risk area in your environment where things might not be getting dry. I already gave this away. What's the required contact time for a disinfectant? Some of them. It depends. Depends on the disinfectant. So I said, Excel, trifecta, label for 30 seconds to 2 minutes. So if you don't have a lot of time, you need to spend the money on a disinfectant that doesn't take a lot of time. It also really depends on the temperature and the amount of organic matter contamination. So if you're working in a cold temperature, it's going to require more contact time than it normally would. So err on the side of extended contact time. We don't have to worry about it that much, but if you're working in a cold environment. And it depends on the presence of organic matter. So if normally you would have a 10-minute contact time, but it's something where you just can't get rid of all the organic matter, it's a cat tree or an unsealed concrete floor, give it 2 hours of contact time. Just give it longer contact time to be active. And then closure time. This is something where it's fairly common, at least we did it. We'd just close a kennel for 2 weeks if it had a parvo dog in it. But 2 weeks was at least 1/52nd of the time necessary for the parvo to just die off on its own. So that wasn't going to help. And meanwhile, having a kennel out of operation for 2 weeks was quite a hardship for us at a small shelter. So if you killed it, you can reopen it. If you didn't, you're probably still in trouble. It can be sort of a compromise to just let it go through 2 or 3 full cleaning, drying cycles. You can just let it go through 3 full cleaning, drying cycles over the course of 3 days. Or if you're in a big hurry, you can do that 3 times in a row just to make sure that you got every nook and cranny and really got adequate contact with every surface. But no closure time. No arbitrary closure time really needed. If it's ringworm, just culture the environment to see how things are going.